Well, if you're ready, then we can start.
Let's do it.
Danielle Smith, I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
As the former leader of the Wildrose Party in the Wildrose province on the Rose Bros podcast, I think this was meant to be.
I think it was too. I've got to figure out a way to connect it with my most recent job, which was going back to business advocacy and going back on into the media on talk radio. I can't off the top of my head think of a Rose connection. Let's see if we can find one by the end.
Yeah, there's a lot of Rose themes going around, so maybe it won't be too hard.
Well, I look at things through rose-colored glasses, so maybe it's my ultimate optimism that keeps me changing careers, going in and out of business advocacy, in and out of media, in and out of politics, which hasn't actually turned out that great for me in the past. I figure third time lucky.
Yep. You've had a lot of careers. What would you describe yourself as these days?
I have always been an advocate. I think that's what the common theme has been in everything that I've done. I've often wondered what it is that motivates me, because some people are motivated to get into public life for different reasons. And I've come down to is that I want to influence good public policy outcomes. It's why I started from a more academic point of view at the Fraser Institute, and then worked my way through being on the school board and being in media with the Calgary Herald, being in media with Global Sunday, being in business advocacy a few times. I was in business advocacy for landowners with a property rights group, small business with Canadian Federation of Independent Business, more recently with Alberta Enterprise Group, and then also just most recently doing talk radio, which was fantastic, and learning about podcasting, which in some ways I think I prefer podcasting to the structure of traditional media, but decided to, and also became a business owner myself. We own a restaurant, so we might not have been, you were maybe not as impacted as we were, because we had the constant opening and closing that occurred during the past 2 years of COVID, but that was also a big learning experience for me. And now that I've got all this knowledge that I've accumulated over 25 years, I figure one last stab at politics, see if people want me. And if not, then maybe I'll just continue with my podcasting career, because I launched into a new show, the Danielle Smith Show, relaunched on the Western Standard online platform, just to give me an opportunity to talk about all the things I care so much about. And I did really miss the interaction with the audience. So in the end, I hope to have some influence on the conversation about where we're going over the next few years, because it's been pretty wild over the last few.
How'd you get into politics specifically? Why public policy?
It's funny. I started off in university with an English degree. And the only real reason I went for an English degree is I loved reading books, and I had a really high grade in grade 12 in English. And so when I finished my English degree, I went to Vancouver. I had a friend who was in the film industry. I thought, oh, maybe this is what I wanted, because I loved drama when I was in high school. I thought, oh, well, maybe this is what I want to do. But it was dead boring sitting on sets as an extra, waiting for hours and hours. And then it would be go, and you would essentially be background walking across the scene, and that's all you would see. So I tried a few of those. I thought, oh, this isn't working. So I went back to waitressing, which is how I got myself through university. And while I was there, I met a group of people who were involved in Reform Party politics. I had been involved in conservative campus politics when I was in Calgary, and started reading works of Ayn Rand and others. And I thought, I better go back to school, because if an English degree only qualifies me to be in the service industry, maybe I need something else. And so that's when I went back for my economics degree. And that's, I think, after I finished my second degree, is when I realized that public policy was the place for me. It's a different type of communicating. It's not drama. I mean, sometimes it can be dramatic, but the speech side of it was something that I enjoyed. It's a little bit of a performance, and it's part of the reason why I wanted to become a good communicator. I always feel like you're going to be able to, if you have ideas that you want to express, you can express them in writing. But I think increasingly in this world that we have, that is online with the podcasts and with YouTube videos, I think increasingly you have to be able to communicate verbally. And so I've spent a lot of years trying to figure out how to do that. So how did I get into politics? I guess I kind of started just on the volunteer and advocacy side. And then my first real foray into politics is when I tried to run for the school board in 1998. I was successful initially, but then I was part of the school board that got fired. So not so successful. You might begin to see a pattern in my career when I decided then to run for political office. Kind of got fired by my constituents at the end of that process as well. And so I'm hoping that this third time that I'm deciding to get back into politics, I hope it ends better.
Would you say Ayn Rand is one of your political influences? Have you read Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead?
Atlas Shrugged, Fountainhead, We the Living. I've got her works of nonfiction as well. We the Living is actually my favorite of her work, but I try to read Atlas Shrugged every few years. And I'm in the process now of trying to build out a broader philosophy than the one she depicts, because I think the positive side of her coming into my life in my mid-20s was that it allowed me to have a really clear pivot towards being very task-oriented, very focused on goal achievement, wanting to be productive, because productive work she talks about as being the highest value for man. And so that really does characterize my last 25 years. But she doesn't have much of an emotional life and doesn't really have much to say about emotions. I think she's quite hostile to them. She's also quite hostile to altruistic tendencies. And when you look at the way the real world works is we're emotional creatures. We're really driven, especially in politics, really driven by passion. You can see politics change on a dime in the course of a campaign or in the day before a campaign vote, just because people are moved from on an issue emotionally. And the other part of it too is if you don't believe in community action and altruism, then there really isn't much of a role for government, because so much of what we do through government is we take care of each other, whether it's in healthcare or education or long-term care or children's services. And so when I think about the kind of government world that Ayn Rand would paint, it's basically has three functions: is that you've got national defense, you've got law courts, and you've got the police. Because I think her whole world is you've got to only have a government to protect your individual rights and individual property rights. But so it's a very limited view of the world. I loved it for as long as it was a bit of a guiding light for me. It was very helpful for me from a personal point of view to get me driven as I am. But I think I'm now working on trying to round things out. My next task is to read Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. I tried to read that years ago, and the character drove me so crazy in the first couple of pages that I couldn't get my way through it. But I have somebody telling me that that's the exact opposite of Ayn Rand. You need to understand what happens to a person when they are totally emotionally driven creatures. And so I'm opening up my mind to that side of the fiction world that I haven't paid as much attention to in the last 25 years, just to get a little bit more balance in my life. I think I need a bit more balance.
Would you identify more as a Peter Keating or a Howard Roark?
I would probably, I liked the Atlas Shrugged characters a little bit more than the Fountainhead characters. Okay. So I think I would probably be more like a Dagny Taggart, right? Every woman who reads Atlas Shrugged sees themselves as cool. Dagny Taggart.
A lot of people like to say they're libertarians, but they never read Ayn Rand, so that's refreshing.
I wonder if she calls herself a libertarian. I have to go back and look at it. There was a big fight going on at the time between Murray Rothbard and Ayn Rand and her philosophy of objectivism, which was a little bit different, but I kind of group her in the same category of authors on the libertarian side of the spectrum.
At the end of March,
what about you? I should ask you, what character do you identify with?
Oh, that's a good question. It's been a while, but I think both would probably be on the side of less emotion, the Peter or Howard. So I don't know. That's a good one. It's been too long. Maybe Peter, maybe. But moving towards politics on your own side, at the end of March, you announced that you were going to run to replace the MLA candidate in your area and potentially seek the Conservative Party nomination. For anyone that is listening, the average listener, what does that mean? Does that mean you need to win the MLA nomination before you can become premier, or how does that work?
Partisan politics is a bit different than, say, school board or municipal politics. If you're running for a local level of office, you can just decide you want to run, slap down your $100, I think is what it is in most areas to get your registration fee, get 25 signatures, and then you can be on the ballot. And then you just have to convince people to vote for you. When you're running for partisan politics, it's a second stage process. So you have to first seek the nomination for a political party. And then if you get the nomination, then you have to run in the general election against other candidates from political parties. You can still run as an independent, but it's difficult. For some reason, we've completely embraced independent politicians at the municipal level, but we've completely rejected independent politicians in provincial and federal office. And I don't know if that's necessarily been good for politics, because you end up with oftentimes a confusion about who do you work for. So when you're seeking the UCP nomination, do you work for the UCP or members in that particular riding? If you get elected, who do you represent? Do you represent the party, or do you represent your constituents? What role do you have in representing the leader? These are all, I think, really important questions, because it gets to the reason of why I decided to enter politics again. There's a culture that was in the Wildrose Party that I absolutely valued. It was the idea that the individual grassroots MLA worked first and foremost for their constituents. And you get elected on a platform, and I totally understand why, when you have a certain number of things that you've promised the public that you want to do, I understand party discipline in those situations, but there's so many issues that come up in between that the party doesn't have any positions on, and you've got to use your best judgment talking to the people in your own area, make sure that you're adequately representing what it is that they want to see. And I think that's missing in politics right now. It's so highly partisan, so heavily driven by what the leader says and the whips and then the kids who work in the office, that I don't feel like the role of the individual MLA is respected. So I am hoping, and I think Brian Jean got back into politics for a similar reason, hoping to bring a little bit more of that respect for the grassroots, respect for local decision-making, respect for local constituents back into the discussion in politics. Because I think it's part of the reason why the UCP has veered off in the wrong direction on a few things, is that I don't know necessarily that the people who got elected under that banner have enough latitude to freely express the views that they're hearing from their own constituents. And so I'm hoping I can add that voice and bring a little bit of that culture back. Because it's not even, I called it a Wildrose culture, but it's also a progressive conservative culture. Going back to the Ralph Klein days, I remember hearing stories about him, how he would tell his cabinet ministers, if you can't get buy-in on your caucus members, you can't take this piece of legislation to the legislature. That's the opposite of what happens now. Sometimes the grassroots MLAs, they don't even hear about legislation until it's already been implemented. And then there isn't even enough time to consult their constituents, and then they have to go to a vote. The Klein even would have people, as I understood it, he would even leave if there was a particularly contentious issue being discussed in caucus, so that everybody would be able to freely state their views. And I think that's really what the political culture in Alberta is all about. I think we've lost some of that over the last number of years, and I hope I can bring that back.
For the regular listener that maybe isn't involved in politics every day, to understand the process, do you have to win the MLA seat to run for premier if things don't go well for Jason Kenney, or can you just run for premier?
So here's how it works. So for me, my first focus is trying to become the MLA. So I want to win the nomination for the UCP here, so I could be the UCP candidate in Livingston McLeod. And then I would have to beat the NDP candidate in this riding and any other candidates that happen to emerge. Because I think if Jason Kenney stays premier, we're going to have a multitude of parties that develop. I think there's a potential for Brian Jean to develop his own party. Drew Barnes wants to develop his own provincial political party. Todd Lowen might start his own party, and Paul Himman has restarted the Wildrose Independence Party. So there'll be a lot of people to run against. And so I don't want to take it for granted, which is why I wanted to make sure that I was starting early so I could do some of that on the groundwork here. If you are interested in the leader job, you can become the leader without having a seat. That's what happened with Jim Prentice, for instance. Jim Prentice came back from Ottawa, and he ran for the leadership. He won, and then a few months later, he got elected in a by-election in Calgary Foothills at the time, which would be the normal way to go about doing it. So technically, yes, you can become the leader of a party and premier, but it has to be the convention in our system is that you have to very quickly, at the earliest opportunity, seek the validation from the people to be elected. It's a bit different than what you see in the States, where the president or the governor runs on their own. They run directly for the office every 4 years. And when they assemble a cabinet of people to help them make decisions, those people don't even need to be elected. So we're very heavily influenced by American politics, which is why I think sometimes we think it works the same way. But there are certain conventions that we have to have in a parliamentary system. And one of the conventions that we've developed is that it is more usual to enter into politics through a partisan label than to try to do it as an independent.
How come you decided to run again now?
A few reasons. I mean, I talked about some of them, about how important I think it is for the grassroots voice to be heard. And there's some big issues down in my area. When I first came back to Alberta after being an intern at the Fraser Institute, I was tapped to be the first managing director of a group called the Canadian Property Rights Research Institute. So I met a bunch of ranchers through that process. And we've got a really complicated system of land management, where we've got competing uses for farmland, ranching land, forestry, coal, oil and gas, and mediating between all of those different uses is something that I learned all the way back in the 1990s. And it's just got more complex as we've gone over the years. There's a couple of coal mine projects that are being proposed down in the Crow's Nest Pass as an example, but then you've got a group of ranchers that are highly opposed to any kind of coal development at all. So is there some way that to find some common ground? I'm going to be going down to Crow's Nest Pass to hear what the residents down there have to say and see what I can do. But I think that those are part of the reason why I think we need to have good representation. So we need people to understand, be willing to listen to all sides, come back in. We also have major food security issues. We've been talking a lot about energy security issues, and I've spent a good portion of my time over the last 5 years understanding emerging technologies, how we might be able to use carbon tech to capture CO2 and turn it into useful products, which is, I think, really exciting. And I think it's part of what allows us to transform the energy industry so that we can be less, have less impact on the environment, but still continue to have those high-paying jobs and all the royalties that go along with it. So I'm excited about that. And now that we've seen the war in Ukraine have it really has cast a pretty strong spotlight on how important energy security is to the world and how important it is to our allies and the role that Canada can play in helping to solve that problem. But we also have a parallel problem in food security because the invasion has disrupted all of our food production, most particularly wheat. And you've got US President Joe Biden talking about how Americans have to be prepared for food shortages, which you just sort of shake your head is baffling. Alberta has it all. We've got energy. We've got immense, beautiful farmland for crops, immense, beautiful rangelands for cattle. We can solve this problem, but we have to be alive to the fact that our governments are putting barriers in the way to allowing us to get goods to market. And so I want to be able to also shine a bit of a light on that. I also think we need to have some strong voices of liberty and freedom. That the past 2 years have been really hard on people. And I don't know if there's a full appreciation from the leadership about what they've done to people by demonizing the unvaxxed and having families fight with families and grandparents fight with their kids about whether or not to vaccinate their grandkids and people not being able to travel. We still have people not able to get on a plane or drive across the border, which is bananas. So there's a lot of work that I think that needs to be done, especially now that we know more about the virus, that it is easily transmissible, that it is, whether you're vaxxed or unvaxxed, is pretty irrelevant into whether you're going to get infected. More focus on early testing so you can get early treatment for the most vulnerable, focus protection. I think that has been the path that some of the red states in the US, like Florida and South Dakota, have and Texas have followed over the last year or so. And it's part of the reason why I think people expected that we would follow the same track in Alberta. Now's the time to do that. And I just want to make sure that that voice of liberty and economic freedom and being aware that there are multiple ways to achieve the same ends. There's multiple ways to keep our vulnerable citizens protected without having a huge burden placed on young children and young families. I think that there's a bit of a hard line that's now been drawn that we saw with the Freedom Convoy. And if I can help articulate some of that frustration and help heal some of that damage that's been caused, that's the other reason why I want to get back in.
If things don't go well for Jason Kenney in the leadership review, how do you plan to run for the leadership position without totally undermining the party and kind of eroding power altogether and losing the election to, say, the NDP?
Well, I think that there are other voices in the party that feel as I do, lots in rural Alberta in particular. And you can, I think, very easily say that going back, looking at I think there's two things that have caused the current government to start losing support. One is the COVID policy, and I think that gets fairly easily resolved by just committing to never do it again, committing that we're not going to have vaccine passports or vaccine mandates, and we're not going to demonize people who make a different medical choice. That it's really we have to be a bit more permissive in what people are allowed to do with their own bodies. And if we can get back to that, which is what we've had in medical choice for a number of years, then I think that we can move past those problems very quickly. I don't know that anyone really begrudges politicians for trying to make the best decisions with the information that they had at the time. I was always frustrated that we were not balancing the lives and livelihoods in the way that I thought would have demonstrated more balance, especially when we started to learn more about the virus. But in the end, Alberta has gotten to a point where we have more freedom than the other provinces, but we're not quite there yet. And I do worry that we haven't firmly said we're not going to do this again. So I think that there needs to be a few more of our voices putting that idea forward. And I don't think it needs to be undermining. I think we can always have respectful disagreement. And I think more and more people are coming around to the view that freedom matters. So I'm not worried about that one. The other part is that the UCP, I think, has a lot of credibility on standing up to Ottawa. The Premier has taken actions against Ottawa in the courts. We have an equalization referendum where he has a mandate from the people to be pushing ahead on trying to end the unfair transfers out of Alberta. But I just don't think that there's been enough action on that. And that's where I think that the UCP has the mandate from their members. They have a number of MLAs who want to get moving on it. They've done a cross-country or cross-province tour to talk about the things that people want to see. And if I can add my voice to that as well, I think it strengthens the UCP. So I just feel like perhaps the last 2 years has pulled the UCP off of its main agenda, its main message. And I don't know if the current leader is going to be able to win back that trust. That's the issue. I mean, that's what's going to be decided May the 18th. If members decide, yes, they want to see him go into the next election, then we watch and see what happens. I've said I worry that the coalition will bust apart and we'll end up with an NDP government. But I'll do my best to try to win the seat for the UCP in Livingston-Macleod, and whichever way it goes, be able to add my voice on the things I care about, the economic freedom message, the personal liberty message, and making sure that we've got strong community supports and are really thinking very thoughtfully about how we can best support our citizens while still maintaining that level of freedom.
Hopefully just a few tweaks to the ship instead of destroying the whole thing and taking down the whole party.
I've done that before, right? I mean, I started off as a progressive conservative, and I spent a lot of years in progressive conservative politics. So when I was the campus president of the Progressive Conservative Club, that was 1992. I worked on Ralph Klein's campaign. I was a charade delegate. I went over to Reform, and then the two parties ended up, after breaking apart, ended up merging. I was supportive of that through the Canadian Alliance and ultimately the Conservative Party of Canada. So I have been in conservative politics for a long time, but it was in 2008 that I just felt like we were going in such a wrong direction. That if you recall what happened in 2008, we had a premier who was demonizing our energy sector. and came through with a really aggressive royalty structure that ended up, I mean, I don't know that our industry has yet recovered from the loss of business confidence that happened with that and with some federal decisions. So that was one line. The other line too was just spending every last penny of resource revenue as it was coming in. I was so disappointed by that because we had started off under Stockwell Day with the idea that we would only have a certain portion of resource revenues that we would spend and we would save the rest. Well, that got thrown out the window. And as we started spending all of our resource wealth, spending the trust fund that Ralph Klein had built up for us, racking up debt, again, it was another hard line for me. We've got a huge opportunity now because we saw resource revenues drop off since 2014. We are now firmly back with a huge amount of resource revenue. I'm a little bit worried that we're just going to spend it all again. And that's what I hope to avoid. The Conservatives are known for having a savings plan. That's what Peter Lougheed put in place. We need a savings plan. Klein is known for putting enough money aside so that we were debt-free, having a debt repayment plan. That's a very conservative value and principle. And so those are the things that I think we can bring back into the party. There are two ways to approach change. One is from the outside, which I tried to do with the Wildrose. It becomes very hard to do because when you're creating a new party, especially in this province, it tends to begin germinating in rural Alberta because that's where I think there's a different type of conservatism than in Calgary and Edmonton. But the problem is that if you only have a rural approach in mind, then it becomes really hard to break through in Calgary and Edmonton. I think that there's a lot more core values that can unite us all. And this is why I like the UCP as a vehicle. I think that it's demonstrated it can win in Calgary, it can win in Edmonton, it can win in rural. It just needs to get back to some of the original principles it was founded on and start taking a bit more aggressive action on the things that its members want. And I think it's a party that can be successful and win again.
You touched a little bit on finances and the balanced budget. Alberta is doing really well right now. There was a surplus, I think, the last budget and whatnot. Paying back debt might be one of your first priorities, but what would be your top 2 or 3 priorities with the extra cash that Alberta has these days?
I'm not as enthusiastic as you are about the surplus because we have $13.8 billion worth of resource revenue and a $500 million surplus, which means we're spending $13.3 billion. And we know that is not sustainable. Our resource revenues went down as low as $2 billion. So we've got a structural deficit that's north of 10 billion. So I'm not going to dance a jig yet about surpluses until we actually get some of these things under control. We've got a choice to make, right? Like I wrote a column or a paper for the School of Public Policy. And at the time I just looked at the numbers and I said, okay, if we've got a $12 billion structural deficit, what are we going to do to solve this? Because you can't solve it all with tax increases and you cannot solve it all with spending cuts. So I had a 3-pronged approach. I think one prong is that we have got to empower people to use more of their own dollars on the things that they care about. So this is where my idea for a health spending account has come in. Because when you look at the last 2 years, most of the trauma, and I think it is a collective trauma that we've suffered, most of it to get back to normal requires services that aren't covered by healthcare. So psychological services, therapy, physiotherapy, chiropractic. If you've been hunched over a computer like I have for the last 2 years on Zoom calls, a nutritionist, gosh, I still have an extra 10 pounds from COVID weight that I put on. And so to me, if we can help people get over what they've gone through over the last 2 years by seeding a fund, a health spending account where they get $350 and then they can pay for the healthcare that they care that they want to use, then you can start changing the system from being we don't treat you until you're sick to we're going to help you keep yourself well, and that'll pay dividends over a period of time. You may be able to allow people to put more of their own money into an account tax-free so that they can save up for braces or laser eye surgery or whatever it is that isn't covered by healthcare. And that's one way is we recognize now healthcare is going to bankrupt our Canadian system, because we're already paying about 50% of every tax dollar on that. We now have all these new therapies that are coming in. We have the ability to map our own genome and get targeted biologics and targeted medicine. Who's going to pay for that? And so we've got to create a mechanism to allow people to use more of their own dollars, so that they can promote their own health on things that the healthcare system isn't going to cover. I think that that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is we do have to figure out a way to steward our resource revenues better. I would put a cap on how much could be used in current year spending. I think when Stockwell Day first put forward his proposal, he said we would never spend more than $3.5 billion, which means the rest would go into savings. And then you could have it invested. And ultimately, it will grow to a size where it's generating enough investment income that you can use that as an additional source of revenue. It wouldn't take that long for us to get to $500 billion like Norway has, so that then you're generating $20 to $25 billion a year in investment income. Why don't we put that out as a target so that we have a new source of revenue that is going to be one that's sustainable rather than just spending every penny as it comes in? And then the third aspect is we do have to have some austerity. I mean, the kind of pain that private sector workers have gone through in the last 7 or 8 years, having to go down to part-time, having to downshift, having to do work sharing, having to take time off. We haven't seen any austerity in the public sector. It's continued to grow. More workers, higher wages. And so I don't even think you need to be that aggressive. We're now spending $62 billion. So find $4 billion worth of savings among all of that. That is a 6 or 7% austerity. That should be very easy to do. If you look at any large corporation, the ability to find $4 billion out of a $62 billion budget, that's the kind of thing you expect your managers to do. So I would think you can take a balanced approach, but we've got to get to a point where we can't keep on pretending that these resource revenues are going to last forever. And we can't sell this fiction to the public that it's a reasonable and prudent way to manage it, to just spend every dollar of it. Because it's a recipe for when the revenues go down, we end up blowing a hole in the budget once again, racking up debt. We now have $114 billion worth of debt. I mean, I don't get excited about surpluses until I start seeing a plan to pay that down so that we can also reduce the amount of our interest payments. So I think we need to spend a little bit more time sharpening the pencil on all of that.
Alberta's lucky to have energy and kind of embarrassment of riches. I'm a fan of the energy industry, but like you're saying, it would be great to have a diverse economy, or maybe some tech moves in, or you have different options. How do you plan to encourage that kind of activity to come to Alberta?
Well, this week I'm moderating a 2-day blockchain conference put on by the Canadian Blockchain Consortium. So I have been an enthusiast and investor in cryptocurrency since about 2016. And to me, we're now at a point, if you just look at what happened in the Miami Bitcoin 2022 conference that happened a few weeks ago, we're now at a point where Bitcoin's here to stay. It's almost $1 trillion in asset value. And so it's not going anywhere. And you've got increasingly, it's being validated by exchanges that allow you to trade it. Toronto Stock Exchange created a Bitcoin fund that you can invest in as an ETF last February. Others followed suit. There's Bitcoin Well, which is a Bitcoin ATM. They are a publicly traded company on the TSX. So it's already being validated by the mainstream. In addition, there are pension fund managers that are looking at holding a portion of their holdings in Bitcoin. So it's an unfamiliar way of thinking about money. But I think that is going to be where the future is. The real problem right now for Bitcoin is that there's a process that they use called mining, where they validate the transactions, and it takes a lot of energy to do it. And as they get further and further along, closer to the limit for the number of Bitcoins that are going to be produced, we're at about 19 million now. There's only 21 million that are ever going to be produced. It's going to cost more and more energy. So there have been a couple of stories about these Bitcoin miners being shut down. In Sturgeon County, they were shut down because the neighbor said it was too loud. In Texas, they were shut down because of instability with the power grid. And to me, this offers a perfect solution for us, that we're already at the forefront. of a cryptocurrency. We've got a leader candidate at the federal level, Pierre Poilievre, who is saying Canada should be the cryptocurrency capital of the world. Why wouldn't Alberta want to be the cryptocurrency capital of Canada? And we could do it by setting up a bunch of little hubs all over the province, put them far enough away from a population base that it's not going to bother any neighbors with the noise, set up our own off-the-grid electrical generation, say with natural gas plants, tack on a little bit of carbon capture technology so that you can turn that carbon stream into useful products like cement or carbon nanofiber or industrial minerals or plastics or ethylene. This is all already technology that is proven and is being implemented. And now you've got the best of all worlds. Now you're able to build pipelines without federal approval because you need natural gas to fund those electricity plants. You can build those electricity plants without federal approval because anything that happens within Alberta's borders are our jurisdiction. If you tack on carbon capture technology, now it's net zero, so you're not interfering with the federal aspirations to get to net zero. So you've created not only new jobs for those who are in both of our traditional sectors of natural gas and electricity, but now you've created a hub that will be an attractor for all the best minds for technology, and you've created an entirely new industry out of not only Bitcoin, but all of the green technologies. To me, it just is such an obvious opportunity for us that would be where I think we could go. And as you start thinking about, well, where would you want to put a hub? Well, maybe we talk to our First Nations friends and see if they want to put a hub on reserve as the first option. Because once you've put a Bitcoin mining operation sited somewhere, guess what you need? You need water. You need electricity. You need to have roads or rail access. You need to have broadband internet access. And there's a lot of underserviced communities in rural and remote communities, a lot of underserviced First Nations. Maybe this is a way for us to have economic reconciliation too. So those are the kind of things that I think we need to start talking about. I feel like we've been spending so much time being oppressed by Ottawa, focusing on the things we're not allowed to do, we can't do, that they're standing in the way of. Let's just find the workaround. That's what we do. We're entrepreneurs. We can be entrepreneurial on this as well. And then have the best and brightest minds of the world, not only in developing new green technologies, but also in all technologies centered in on Alberta. There's also a very strong freedom strain going through that group of Bitcoin entrepreneurs. They are allergic to central power. They are allergic to intermediaries and the big established elites and the big established interests. And to me, that is already the culture that Alberta was founded on. So why wouldn't we create a welcoming environment for them to be able to site their locations here? I think it could be extraordinary.
Absolutely. It seems like that theme has kind of popped up on the Wildrose podcast, actually, with companies like Entropy Inc., the carbon capture company, and Rundle Eco Services, where they're recycling materials used in the energy industry, kind of
Love it.
Taking an innovative approach to traditional industry. So,
well, the thing about all the new carbon tech is that most of the people who are advancing it are people who come from the traditional industries.
Exactly.
Because you need to be able to see a problem to come up with the solution. And so we are at the perfect nexus point to have some of the best and brightest minds working on this. And then we develop solutions that'll be exported to the world. I am so bullish on Alberta. I'm so optimistic about what it is that we can accomplish. I think that there's an incredible future ahead, but governments can stand in the way. Government regulatory approval processes. If it takes 5 or 10 years to get anything approved and permits and anything done, then it's going to delay our ability to move forward. I'll tell you a story that I heard when I was in my last role as business advocacy. The group, Alberta Enterprise Group, used to take people down for trade missions. And the last trade mission they did was to Nevada in 2018. And there was a guy by the name of Lance Gilman who had this vision for an industrial park. So he identified 120,000 acres. You got the fire chief and the local mayor and the governor all on board with fast tracking grading and building permits so that you could get a grading permit within 7 days and a building permit within 30 days. And he wanted to attract an anchor tenant. So he set out to attract Elon Musk. Elon Musk wouldn't give him the time of day. said, sorry, why would I bother? If I tried to set up here, it's going to take me 4 years to get any approvals. You got 15 minutes of Elon Musk time. They sat around a card table in the area and they signed off on the grading permit right there. And so Musk said, you mean I can move that fast? Stood up, walked outside. He said, anything within my line of sight, I want, because I want to build my gigafactory here. He wants the gigafactory to be the biggest factory on planet Earth so that you can see it from Google. And sure enough, he built it. And and it attracted all of the auxiliary businesses around it. When we contacted Ladin Skillman last year to find out how he was going, he said, we've already filled the park and now I'm looking to site another one. And it begins with that very simple solution. You say yes instead of no. You say, yes, we trust you that you're going to follow the regulations. So we'll give you the permit to go ahead and just follow the rules and don't give us a reason to say no. That flips the approval process on its head, because right now we have a bunch of regulators who say, don't believe you, prove to me that you're going to do this, that, or the other thing. And they delay the process for 5 or 10 years or longer, and it scares business away. So to me, if we can get this notion of we believe yes should be the answer, and if we're going to tell you no, we have to justify why we're telling you no, that can change everything. And that I think is going to be really important if we're going to attract any businesses. Because look, technology, these Bitcoin mining operations, the equipment that they need becomes obsolete after 3 years, because you need new computing technology to be able to keep up with all of the formulas that you need to solve. So can you imagine, like, you're not going to be successful attracting mining operations if you say, okay, well, put in your proposal now, and 10 years from now, we might get it built. You'll have missed 3 turns on it. So Alberta has to be a place that moves as fast as technology. They talk about moving at the speed of business. Moving at the speed of technology businesses is even faster. I don't think that we've done a very good job keeping up on that, but that doesn't mean that you can't, with a change of attitude and a commitment, because I think that will be the secret to diversification.
I think there's a similar example of the governor in Texas doing the same thing with Elon Musk, where he basically told them they'd get it built, and sure enough, they did.
That's all businesses need. You know, I think in some ways, conservatives have always felt like, conservatives know this. I mean, they talk about streamlining red tape or regulations, and they talk about creating an attractive business environment with a low rate of taxes. But it doesn't do you much good to have a low rate of taxes if it takes 10 years for you to get to a point where you're earning enough income so that you can get that tax rate. The thing that matters to business is being able to build and get into operation as fast as possible. And so it's all about permitting. It's all about saying yes. And I think we've gotten down the wrong track on this, because we've got regulators who've essentially been told, say no until they prove to you that you should say yes. And so you've got these bizarre situations where even at municipal levels of government, I've heard these stories where a person isn't allowed to start construction on a massive building project until the bureaucrats are happy with the number of trees and the size and the species of them that is going to be planted outside the doorway when the project is completed. That's absurd. You should say, okay, the main purpose is for you to build this warehouse. We know you're going to plant trees at some future point. Let's just put that on a list of things we've got to resolve later and get started. We don't have to have a complete, perfect, gift wrap packaged up project from beginning to end before we say yes. You can say yes and then work with the regulators through the process. And there's already some jurisdictions that get this. Edmonton has a bit of a concierge type service where they have a client services division that work with big projects to get them through the process. They meet every week, make sure everyone's meeting their targets. That to me is the model, is that as long as people know that they can get a yes and that they can work through any regulatory issues along the way, that's a much healthier way to create a business environment that's going to attract people.
Kind of a trust then verify sort of philosophy.
It is. And the verify is important because people want to make sure no one's cutting corners. But look, if somebody's going to invest millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars, or let's call it billions of dollars, because that's how big some of these projects are now, do you really think they're going to skimp when it comes to planting trees outside of their building? Do you really? Like, you have to have a little bit of trust. People who have done mega projects know what's expected of them, and let's honor the fact that they have some expertise so that we can say yes rather than say no.
in your opinion, the current government has some work to do. If you were to highlight maybe 2 or 3 things that you would change with the current Conservative government, what would you touch on?
Number one, healthcare. We cannot get the budget back in balance until we have a healthcare system that performs at the level that we need it to without eating up more resources. So I've already talked to you about health spending accounts, but we need to change the governance structure. To me, in government, the only thing you can really control is who gets the money and who makes the decision. And what we've done is we've just centralized. We've now got to a point where we give most of our money to an unelected bureaucrat at the head of Alberta Health Services. And then we say, oh, sorry, we can't intervene and do anything because we've delegated $20 to $25 billion worth of spending to this one person who's in control of everything. How did anyone think that that was going to go well? How does that one person know what the services should be at Milk River or in Fairview? Because I can assure you they don't, because I've been to Milk River and I've been to Fairview. And I'll tell you the kind of problems that you see. When you have an overly structured hierarchical system where all the decisions are made at the top, in Milk River, they told me they needed to buy a bottle of bleach and weren't allowed to because they had to go through the central procurement process for Alberta Health Services. When I was in Fairview, I was told they had a light bulb that was out in the emergency waiting room area and they couldn't change it themselves without calling over to the regional district to send out an electrician to change the light bulbs. These are not efficient uses of our resources. Just let them make their own decisions at the local level, empower them. So you have to change the governance structure so that we restore local hospital administrators with the autonomy to make local decisions. And then you can build it up from there. We've got a lot of models where there are many, many organizations do that, where they have a local franchise or a local business that has local managers, but then they coordinate regionally to make sure that if there's regional issues, they can collaborate them on them together. And then your regional zones also would have a provincial representative so that if you need to collaborate on things provincially, you would be able to do that. But all the key money and decision making needs to happen closer to the people who are being served and the people who are actually running the facilities. I think we'd end up with so much more innovation. We'd end up, one of the things that that happened as we started centralizing services is that I think because it's so complex, the way to simplify was, well, let's just shut those emergency rooms down and move things to a bigger center. And so when you get into a situation like you did with COVID, where now so much is concentrated in Calgary and Edmonton, that when COVID takes over in the hospitals in Calgary and Edmonton, it stops everything. It stops surgeries from being performed. Why can't we push out so that baby delivery can be done in some of the rural hospitals, or gallbladder surgery, hernias, vasectomies, general day surgery, knees and hips? All of this doesn't need to be done necessarily in Calgary and Edmonton, so that if we ever end up with another deadly virus, you reserve your Calgary hospitals for the most acute patients, but you can still keep the surgeries going in the rest of the province. But because we centralized the system so much, depleted the capacity, converted operating rooms into storage areas, pulled out all of the expertise of surgeons and anesthesiologists from these communities, we've ended up ending with a worse performing health system when we needed the most. So I would say that we've tried the centralization experiment. There's some things that probably should stay centralized. Probably makes sense to do central procurement of expensive drugs. Probably makes sense to, if you can, have a centralized payroll system so that you've got some expertise in HR to manage hiring and firing and paying people. But when it comes to the day-to-day management of what's happening at a facility, that's got to be pushed back down. So that would be one huge area. Sorry, I spent a lot of time on it. It's just I've spent a lot of time thinking about how that one needed to be solved. Number two is we need a savings plan, because we're not going to solve our long-term problem of reliance on resource revenues until we develop that new income stream. Number three, we have to develop a debt repayment plan. I think part of the culture of Alberta, one of the things that we were so proud of was being debt-free. We have to embrace that strategy again, even if it takes 50 years to do it, because all you can pay down is $2 billion a year. You've got to start somewhere and have some kind of objective of how you're going to reach it. And then the sort of, if you want me to keep going, those Absolutely. Are the three big areas.
Yeah.
The fourth big area, of course, is accepting that the energy sector and the entrepreneurs they're up to the challenge of reaching net zero targets. They really are, with the carbon technology being developed, the fact that you've got our big 5 oil sands players who are looking at developing their own carbon trunk line and reaching net zero by 2050. If that's what's happening in the entrepreneurial sector, let's find a way to enable it so that we can get there faster than anyone else, because I think we can. I think we can be net zero, and I think we can be there before the rest of the country. And that, I think, would go a long way towards solving some of the problems that we have with Ottawa. Because then there's a whole suite of things that we need to do. As a grown-up province with a diversified economy, growing population, more revenues, we need to collect our own income tax. We need to have our own employment insurance program, and communities that want it, they need to have their own provincial police. We have to stop relying on Ottawa to be doing the things that we should be doing ourselves. We can't say we're upset that Ottawa takes so much of our revenue and doesn't give it back. Well, let's stand on our own 2 feet, the way Ontario does and the way Quebec does. If we want to be treated as an equal partner in Confederation, we have to start acting like it. So there's a whole battery of things that I would suggest that we need to do along those lines as well. And I think we're going in the right direction on many of them. That's why I'm aligned with the UCP party. I just think that we've stalled out on a couple of things over the last couple of years because we got distracted with a very serious health issue. And then it seems like the government hasn't been able to move forward on a lot of those things. And it's unfortunately caused them to lose a level of support.
You could go down the rabbit hole for quite a while on transfer payments, but in maybe 1 or 2 sentences, is it possible to reform for Alberta?
I would say we could, tomorrow, if we wanted to, we could say, Ottawa, we're collecting our own personal income taxes. And we could let the payroll companies know, and all they would do is just create a new line item. I mean, I do payroll for my company, and so I know how it works. I use Payworks, and I press a button, and I send a check to Payworks, and they send a portion to the federal government for my taxes, and a portion to CPP, and a portion to EI, and a portion to workers' compensation. It'd be very easy for them to change that automatic system, so they're sending a portion directly to Alberta. It's not complicated to do, but it's important from a philosophical point of view, so that we can show that we can develop the capacity to do these things ourselves. Because Ottawa has continued to take more and more and more from us and not return it back to us. I would like people to know, every dollar you send to Ottawa is a dollar that is going somewhere else, because I think people are don't understand just how much that transfer is. It's about half of the federal taxes we pay that do not come back here in the form of services. So that would be one thing that we could fix tomorrow. Employment insurance might take a little longer, but we have demonstrated that we need to have a different employment insurance program. When you look at the number of people who paid and paid and paid into the system, we have a much higher workforce participation rate, lower number of absences from the workplace. But when we got hammered hard in 2014, we had people who've been paying all their lives and never collected, who weren't able to access the same number of weeks as you did if you lived in Eastern Canada. How can that be? How can we be paying more, receiving less, and then when there's surpluses in the fund, the government just steals it in general revenues? No, we don't want to do this anymore. So employment insurance would be another one. I think personally, Alberta pension plan makes a lot of sense. I think that there's a lot of nervous seniors, so it would take some work to help to explain it. But my understanding, based on government work, is that we're paying pretty much 3 times what we should be paying based on our population. I even had been told that the amount of revenues that are sitting in that CPP fund, $700 billion in assets, $400 billion are contributions that came from Alberta because we over-contribute. Well, if we had our own pension plan, not only would we be able to reduce the premiums to make it easier to hire workers, we'd also be able to increase the amount of money that we pay our seniors. And on top of that, we would develop a pot of money that we could choose to invest where we want to. Right now, the Canada Pension Plan Board has one representative from Western Canada, and they're from Vancouver. So how does that work? That we pay more in than anyone else, and the amount of assets accumulating are to the credit of Alberta more than anyone else, and we don't get a say? That doesn't make sense to me. But I think we'd have to do a little bit more work on that. Provincial police is surprisingly controversial for me, because I'm in the High River area. I was distressed to see how the RCMP treated my community during the floods, bashing down doors, targeting homes with guns, confiscating guns, and then when all was said and done, they said, "Oh, well, we don't think that we should have to pay to replace those doors." I had to do a town hall meeting to just make the RCMP aware of how angry people were at how they were being treated, to finally get some proper compensation. They wanted to just install builders quality doors. And a lot of these homes, some of these homes had beautiful, glorious glass doors that were thousands of dollars. And they were very cavalier about how they treated people's property. On top of that, we've seen the missing and murdered Indigenous women file that has been mishandled by the RCMP. We've seen the civilian workforce say that they're victims of bullying, the female workforce saying they're victims of bullying, even men in the RCMP saying they're victims of bullying. So I feel like the RCMP is not the entity that it once was. And maybe the way you get them back to doing what they should do, which is be our national police force, focus on important national issues like human trafficking and organized crime and terrorism and cross-border smuggling, then maybe we need to be leaving community policing to other levels of law enforcement. So those would be some of the things that we could do. I have obviously more I could talk about, but to me, you've got to get started somewhere, and those would be the easiest places to get started.
Maybe you could sum it up with taxation with representation, maybe. In
that is really, it's true. You've got it. I mean, there's so much that comes out of this province that is decided on by other politicians. And we don't have fairness in our representation on the number of MPs we have. We don't have fairness in the representation we have and the number of Senate seats we have. And so if that's the case, I would rather see more decision-making return to Alberta and more dollars stay in this province so that we can actually have some direction to our local representatives that really matter, so that their actions are matching what it is Albertans want to see.
Wow, we're at 57 minutes.
Oh my gosh.
I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, you told me we talked for 30 minutes or so. So well, get me going.
I can keep going, but I won't take too much more of your time. You are an example of a strong female leader. What advice would you give to other young women out there that maybe are looking to advance in politics or in life in general?
It won't surprise you, since I've made my career speaking and communicating, is I read a book by Dale Carnegie on public speaking. This is going to sound a little bit cynical, so I'll say the line, but then I'll explain it. He said, if you learn how to speak well, people will give you credit for being smarter than you actually are. And some may say that's the story of your life, Danielle, but that's the point. What I've often found with women, especially young women, is that they don't speak up in meetings. And they don't make their voices heard when they're in a roundtable discussion. And if they get invited to some kind of symposium, they defer and they let others speak. And when I look back on my career, it was by speaking up every opportunity I was given that I just rose to the level of decision makers. And they said, oh, she seems to be on the ball. And they gave me more opportunities. And speaking is terrifying. It's hard to do. I was terrible at it. I didn't used to be able to string a sentence together unless it was written down first. And even though I loved model parliament, I was too afraid to get up and speak because I didn't think that the words would come out right. And so it's not easy when you first do it. So you have to go to Toastmasters, which I did, and you have to go to Dale Carnegie courses, which I did, and you have to take opportunities to be in classes where you give speeches, which I did, and take jobs that allow you to speak. Because to me, especially in this new world, being able to communicate is really going to be what separates people as we start looking at opportunities. And if I could give women in particular any kind of advice, I would say that, because I'm not sure why it is women and men are socialized a little bit differently, but men don't seem to have the problem in public meetings making their voice heard. And I think a lot of women think, if I just do good work, I'll be recognized for it. But sometimes you got to be prepared to do good work and let everyone know and take some credit for it. And if you let everyone know, it just opens up a world of opportunities. That to me has probably been the key to all the opportunities that I've had, is that I learned early that I just had to speak up.
Well, I think that's a great conversation.
Well, thank you.
Wrap it up there.
Excellent. Thanks so much for having me on.
I really appreciate your time. If someone wants to learn more about your upcoming campaign or information about you, where can they find you online or anywhere else?
The best place to go is daniellesmith.ca. It's where I've created it as a bit of a portal to get to everything else. So once you land there, you'll see that there's a place that can redirect you to my campaign site, but then also you can stay on my website and see some of the podcasts and other things that I'm doing. I actually have to update it since I just started my new Danielle Smith Show podcast. You've just reminded me I don't have that on the website yet, but I will. But that's the best place to go.
Awesome. Well, we'll wrap it up there.
Thanks so much.